Hello everyone, welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're going to talk about some of the main points in a brief introduction to philosophical argumentation and the use of language, two documents that I wrote and have put up on Moodle. Now, again, as with some of the other information I've put up, if you're already familiar with philosophy, if you've taken another philosophy class, particularly if you've done one with me, you might have run into quite a bit of this material before. None of this is horribly novel or controversial. So if you're already pretty comfortable with what philosophy is and what we're going to be doing in the course, feel free to watch the video, go through the readings, certainly. But there's nothing in there that should surprise you if you're already familiar with philosophy. It might be a nice refresher or just sort of a different take on things. If you haven't done any philosophy before, going through these pieces should help give you a better idea of really just what it is we do and how to try to do it well. You could conceive of these documents along with the what is philosophy in some sense sort of like the methods section of the course. You know, what is philosophy? What are we going to do? How do I do that well? And of course, this is going to be sort of broad, general overview. So these are all points to keep in mind as you're trying to do your writing and so on, as well as you're reading, because as you're going through the readings and seeing what these other thinkers have to say, you can evaluate them using some of the tools that are introduced here. And some of those tools are really just what the characteristics of excellent arguments really are. And you can keep those in mind, so when you're reading through other people and you say, oh, well, you're really falling short of the ideal in this way or that way, those are grounds for criticism, which is something to keep in mind, because that's certainly something you can, and in some sense probably should be doing in your own writing. So we'll start with a brief introduction to philosophical argumentation. A little bit of a warning, there is some overlap with the use of language as well, so you can consider this first piece as a longer introduction to what's going on, a little bit more detail. The second piece, a little bit more succinct, more straightforward advice in some sense as well. So coming back to the use of language, particularly when you're doing your own writing, might be a good idea. So philosophy, as I was talking about in the What is Philosophy piece in the video that went with it, can really be understood as a certain sort of tradition, a certain sort of enterprise that has certain sorts of topics and questions it's generally interested in. But being committed to the use of reason, another way we can understand what philosophy really is and what it really does is that it's the analysis, evaluation, and creation of arguments. So we read other philosophers, we talk to each other, we communicate in writing. That's very typical. Try to analyze what we're saying. We try to understand each other. We try to create our own arguments, and often our own creations come out of evaluating what other people have already said and what other people have thought. So for instance, in our course here, The Meaning of Life, what I'm not looking for and what I'm not expecting is for you to just, in some sense, share your opinion completely disconnected from the readings or the other material. Now, of course, that's something we can do, and especially in the introductory forum, where I've asked that optional question, you know, what do you think the meaning of life is right now in just a couple of sentences? That's absolutely a place to just sort of say, here's what I think. Great, like that's wonderful, and I do want to hear your view. What I don't want to hear in your written work is just a description of what other people have said. Right? That's a good first step. That's a necessary first step to bringing your own ideas in a conversation with the ideas of others and showing how you agree with people, how you disagree with people, and the reasons that you agree and disagree with them, and the reasons that you can give for other people to agree with you. So ultimately, philosophy is a product of our nature as reasonable and rational creatures, or at least potentially reasonable and rational creatures. So we can understand philosophy really as this activity of argumentation, right? Particularly argumentation on certain sorts of topics that tend not to be engaged with by other sorts of disciplines. So philosophical arguments, really just arguments in general, but we'll stick with philosophical arguments here, because we're not talking about, you know, disputes between people. We're not talking about when people fight each other and get mad and yell and scream. Though philosophers can get mad and yell and scream just like anybody else. But when we're thinking about arguments in the sense we're really interested in this course, because I don't want to get mad and yell and scream, right? I find it's much more fun to sit around in a friendly manner and exchange reasons and realize, hey, I could really be wrong on something because this is difficult stuff, right? The world doesn't just sort of give up its secrets and tell us how everything works. We've got to think about that. It's up to us. So philosophical arguments, in the sense we're interested in, are really a series of statements. And those statements try to provide one or more reasons to believe that something is true. Now, in an argument, one part of the argument will always be the conclusion. Ultimately, that's probably going to be one statement. It could be a set of statements, potentially. But you're going to have a conclusion. That's really what this diagram down in the right-hand corner is. The conclusion is what gets support. The other parts of the argument, other sentences, other statements, will provide the support to the conclusion. Those other statements, the one that do the supporting, are called premises or reasons. And you see I've put premise and I put reason onto two little bubbles there that have arrows and are supporting the conclusion. For our purposes in this course, we can just use those terms interchangeably. You know, what's your premise? What's your reason? In either case, a premise or a reason gives support to a conclusion. A conclusion gets the support from the premise or the reason. You can have multiple reasons, multiple premises, all supporting the same conclusion. Right? As we're going to see, you can also have reasons not to believe a particular conclusion. We can reason about our reasoning. Right? These things can get very, very complicated. In its simplest form, an argument is one reason in favor of one conclusion. Right? That's as simple as it gets. If you don't have both of those parts, you can't have an argument. But there's really no hard limit to how many reasons there might be. And in fact, arguments can get very detailed and very complex very quickly, as they do, and you're going to see that in this course. Ideally, what we're trying to do is make the arguments as clear as possible. Even when they're complicated and there's a lot going on in them, ultimately what we want to do is make them understandable, make them accessible, right? Make them the sort of thing that just about anybody could engage with, they could read or listen to, they can understand it, they can say, yeah, I see how that works, I understand that. Even if maybe I'm not going to believe the conclusion yet, at least I see the connection between the premises and the conclusion. So this is really what we're interested in. It's the arguments as a series of statements, at least one of which, the conclusion, gets support, at least one of which, the premise or the reason, provides the support. Now, arguments can be additionally complicated. You're always going to have some one main conclusion, some ultimate point, right? What you're trying to convince people to believe through providing good reasons. You can also have more complicated structures where you have a main conclusion, the final conclusion that you're trying to get towards, and you can have intermediate steps along the way where you start by providing some premise or reason. You always have to start somewhere. So you start by putting forward a statement or a series of statements that seem pretty obviously true. You can then work in a step-by-step fashion that those initial reasons can support a conclusion. That conclusion can then act as a reason for something else, which can then act as a reason for something else. So we can build arguments up in stages, or right. So we can sort of go up with the metaphor or go across, right? You sort of start at the base level, things that everybody should probably believe, things that aren't very controversial, and then move in a step-by-step fashion to more and more controversial points, ultimately reaching the main conclusion that you're trying to convince people is true. So those conclusions along the way we call sub-conclusions. So sub-conclusion is something that's supported by premises or reasons. It's not just the kind of thing people will believe on its own. It's controversial enough. People will probably say, well, why should I believe that? So you try to give them good reasons. Once they believe that, you can then use that point to further support some other conclusion. Now, in this course, other than for the argument assignment, where I'm going to ask you specifically to pick apart and show me what the conclusion that you're trying to argue is, what the reasons are. You don't have to really do this in your written work or on the forums. You don't have to say, my conclusion is this. First reason is this. Second reason is that. You don't really have to do that. But ultimately, in a really well-written argument, it's going to be clear. There's going to be no confusion about what the conclusion is. There's going to be no confusion about what the premises or reasons are that support them and how it is they're supposed to support them. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that arguments and explanations are different things, although they can seem quite similar. Explanations take some phenomenon, some state of affairs, some thing, whatever it is, and try to give us additional details to increase our understanding. They try to give us a deeper understanding of what's going on in the world around us. They try to give us context for what's going on, try to give us more information about it. But in some sense, they're not really trying to convince us of anything. They're really just describing the world. They're giving us information. So look, for instance, if you picked up a newspaper or something like that, and you read a news piece that's just telling you about what's going on. Say there's a car accident in Lethbridge, right, on the Whoop-Up Bridge. So there's, say a car accident happens. If you picked up the Lethbridge Herald and said, oh, on May 6th, there was a car accident on the Whoop-Up Bridge. It happened at 12:55 p.m. It was on the westbound lanes. It was on the rightmost lane. Somebody's brakes failed, and then they sort of hit the guardrail, and there's 3 vehicles involved in the end, but nobody's really hurt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The paper's not really trying to convince you that happened. It's telling you that it happened, and it's giving you information, when it happened, how it happened, who was involved, right? The good old questions, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. I think I got that right. Answering those questions. Explanations do that just by giving you information that the person giving you the information, or really the source, is really just expecting you to believe it. Right? Of course, you could read the Lethbridge Herald piece about this theoretical car accident. I hope there wasn't actually one today at that time. Right? You could read it and say, why should I believe this? The paper's not really going to answer that question. Just sort of assumes that you're going to. Of course, you could try to engage with them a little bit, but as soon as you start asking, why should I believe that? In some sense, you're moving beyond an explanation and you're moving into the territory of an argument. Arguments and explanations can seem quite similar. Sometimes you can read something and not be sure if it's intended as an argument or an explanation. And look, as somebody who's been engaged in philosophy for quite a while, about half my life now, I still get this. I pick something up, I look at it, and I go, I wonder if this is supposed to be an explanation or an argument. Really, the difference lies in the intention of the speaker and what they're trying to do, speaker or writer. So explanations just describe the world. They just give you information. They give you more context. They try to deepen your understanding and so on. Arguments are normative. Now, when something's normative rather than being merely descriptive, it concerns the way things should be, right? Not just how they are. It's not just telling you, well, this is just what it is, but they're really trying to convince you to believe something. So before I said, if you looked at the Lethbridge Herald or some kind of news site and they're giving you information, if you went, why should I believe this? Why should I actually believe what you're telling me? Now you're asking for an argument. Really what you're asking for by saying that is, what reason or set of reasons do I have to believe that what I'm being told in the Lethbridge Herald or whatever the source is actually true, that this really happened? Because of course, there can be false information, right? I'm sure you've heard a lot about fake news in recent years. There can be fake news, right? What is that really? When somebody says something that's not true and presents it as a piece of news, right? It's pretty simple. Although perhaps not everybody that bandies the phrase about really thinks of it in those terms. But that's really what it is. And look, should you believe absolutely everything you read? No, not everything. But depending on the source of the information, it does give you some good reason to believe it, at least initially, if the source of information is generally reliable. And of course, there are questions about how to establish if a source of information is generally reliable. As soon as we're dealing with these sorts of questions, we're dealing with arguments, right? What should I believe and why should I believe it? As soon as we get into the should, we're dealing with something normative, and that's really what arguments are. So philosophy isn't just describing the world. It's not just telling us bits of information. It's not just little, facts and figures, which is not to say those things aren't important. I was making this point in the What is Philosophy video as well. philosophy is not just getting more facts. Getting more facts is crucially important. It deepens our understanding of the world. Explanations are wonderful things to have. Knowing how the world works, increasing our understanding. These are all incredibly valuable things. Philosophy is engaged in something a little bit different because it's really trying to ask and answer these questions about what should we really believe or what should we really do. So philosophy is normative. And in fact, disciplines other than philosophy do engage in arguments, particularly when they come up with something controversial. So if you are in a discipline, right, say a natural science or something, quite often what goes on there are descriptive elements. There's still some reasoning involved in terms of thinking about what's going on in front of you and what that means. So there's still some argumentation. And in particular, when something controversial happens, there's an unexpected result, or there's some disagreement over how to interpret the results of a particular kind of test or something like that, then there are going to be arguments there. What should chemists and biologists and physicists believe? There's real disagreement there because the world is a complicated place and it allows for multiple informed and reasonable views about what's going on that can't all be true. Now, ultimately, what are we really trying to do in philosophy as well as in other sorts of disciplines? Really think carefully about anything and everything and really take the time to discard views that seem to really not stand up to scrutiny and to take the ones that do stand up to scrutiny, that is, take the views that are already supported by reasons and try to comparatively evaluate them to figure out which ones are best supported by reasons. At what point do reasons support multiple conflicting positions? What positions can we rule out over time as we get new information and come to realize how our different parts of our reasoning and our beliefs fit together in certain sorts of ways? This is really what we're trying to do in this collective process. Now, one point to make here before we move on is that arguments can be about anything, including explanations. So arguments can be about explanations, arguments can be about arguments. Right? We can argue, as I was just saying, about how best to explain a particular result or what's going on. We can argue about the nature of arguments themselves, which are interesting sorts of arguments to have. But ultimately, when it gets down to it, arguments are really just the exchange of reasons, right? Trying to support one point with one or more other points, right? Taking things we already believe to figure out what follows from that. And in one way to think of philosophy, and this I think would probably be a bit of a controversial way to put it, but I think it's also a good way to put it. I think this is descriptively accurate for a lot of what we do in philosophy, is running a kind of coherence test amongst our beliefs, right? Because we have all kinds of beliefs about all sorts of things, right? And I could give you all sorts of trivial beliefs I have, like today is Wednesday, I think. It's probably Wednesday, right? Today's Wednesday, it's the month of May, I'm living in Lethbridge, my name is Carl, I'm instructing a philosophy class right now, I'm making a video. There are many books around me. There's so many beliefs that we all have. Now, a lot of them aren't all that important in some sense, but there's a real question about how they all fit together and when they are or are not coherent with each other. And when they aren't coherent, when they run into some kind of conflict, that's really when we can take a step back and say, well, how do I get rid of this conflict? What belief should I hold on to? Which one should I give up on? Which one should I rethink? What should I just suspend judgment about for now? I think philosophy ultimately can help us with that kind of activity. Okay. One other part of arguments are objections. So, like I said, arguments really are made up of the premises or reasons that support conclusions, but we can also pose objections to arguments, and arguments themselves can involve objections. They can really be based on objections. They can raise and respond to objections. An objection really is just some reason to believe that an argument is faulty in some way. Now, arguments can be faulty in a number of ways. Ideally, a really great argument, we're going to talk more about this on the next slide or the slide after, really great argument has premises that are true, they're believable, they're at least acceptable, we think they're true. they then support conclusions, the conclusion becomes more believable on the basis of the premises. Right? The premises are the reasons justify us in believing the conclusion. They serve as evidence for the conclusion. Right? We have this act of reasoning, we call it an inference, where you go from some premise or reason to the conclusion, and you sort of see, sort of mentally, it's this kind of mental connection we make between things, where you see how one leads to the other or one supports the other. Objections try to show that there's some kind of problem in the argument. And they can do this in a few different ways. Really, the main ways are that they just try to show directly that the argument's conclusion is likely false. That is, they give us reasons to believe the conclusion is probably false rather than probably true. Right? Objections can also try to provide reason. So really, objections are another kind of argument, really. So when we're thinking about arguments and objections, an objection is really a kind of argument against an argument. And this is the thing, arguments in some sense never end, right? They in some sense almost never stop, and they never start. We're just always in this process of reasoning about the world around us. So an objection can just directly object to an argument's conclusion, just try to show us that it's probably false. An objection can object to the premises in the argument, try to say that the basis of the argument, the evidence, what's supposed to be supporting the conclusion, is actually probably false. When premises or reasons are put forward, they're always put forward as true. So if they turn out to be false, that's a problem with the argument. An objection can also try to admit that the premises are true, or it could even just say, look, I'll just assume the premises are true. Let's not get caught up here. I'll just grant you what you claim as a premise or reason or a piece of evidence. I'll just admit it's true, but object to the inference from that particular premise or whatever we want to call it to the particular conclusion. That is, I'll object to the actual inference being made that this premise or set of premises don't really support that conclusion after all. Right? That the connection isn't as strong as it was claimed to be. So great arguments consider objections, and really the activity of argumentation, of philosophy in general. If you look at it as this history, we can think about philosophy as really being engaged with certain sorts of topics and certain sorts of questions, trying to reason about them and find the best answers, the ones that are supported best by reasons. Those arguments get produced by people, and other people, or even the same people themselves, come along and pose objections, point out problems with the arguments that are there, and try to build better arguments in light of the objections. And there have been some famous philosophers who have, in some sense, flip-flopped, because they put forward some kind of argument. They say, this conclusion's true, and here are the reasons for it. And at a later point in their career, or their thinking, or their life, they say, well, you know, people have been raising these sorts of objections to that position. I now think those people are right. I don't think the position's correct anymore. And I've changed my mind. I think those objections really work. Here's the new position I take up. Now, something I've noted in the forums is that really what we're focused on are the arguments themselves and not the people. So even if a particular person puts forward an argument and at some point rejects it and says, oh, I actually don't believe it works anymore. I don't think the conclusion's right. I don't think the reasons work. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily give us reason to think that the argument's actually false. The person could now be wrong that the argument doesn't work. Right? They could also be wrong when they first put the argument forward. Now, we should always be sensitive to who is making the arguments, giving people credit, being specific about who said what and where they said it, you know, who said what, which sort of text. So, you know, when I see, you can look up famous quotes and things like this on the internet, and when I see something attributed to some author or thinker, but then it doesn't tell you what text it's in or what page it's on, I look at that basically as a kind of gossip. Right? It's not specific enough. Tell me exactly where they said that, so I can go look it up for myself, so I can go see the context around it, so I can check, right? How do I know they really said that unless I can go to a text? So we want to be specific. We want to be honest about who says what, but Ultimately, we want to focus on the arguments, we want to look at the reasons, the conclusions, the objections that can be raised, and ultimately use our own power of reasoning to try to evaluate those and make clear why we evaluate reasons and arguments the way that we do. Okay, the qualities of excellent arguments. Consider this sort of a series of tips on how to produce excellent arguments yourself, as well as a series of criteria you can use when trying to evaluate the arguments of others. Now, I'm sure I could keep adding to this list. I could probably come up with at least 20 different qualities to put on the list, but I don't want to overwhelm you and just sort of have all the stuff floating around the air, so I've tried to keep it fairly brief. And as I mentioned before, there's going to be a little overlap with the use of language piece. Consider that overlap a good point of emphasis. So when I'm making the same point in both texts, consider that a fairly important point that I'm trying to make. So excellent arguments, what are those like? What kinds of qualities do they have? Well, first, they're very clear. And in fact, at least to me, some of the arguments and some of the texts we're going to look at in this course are not as clear as they could be, or perhaps should be. Try to make yourself as clear as possible at all times. I'm going to endeavor to do that whenever if I say anything or write anything that doesn't make full sense to you, please, please, please contact me, particularly if it's on an assignment instruction or something. If you have the question, it's likely that somebody else has the question. One issue with communication is that we're typically very clear to ourselves because we know what we want to say or what we're trying to say or express. But of course, language communication is an interpersonal activity. Just because you've put it some way doesn't mean that somebody else understands it in the same way that you've tried to express it. Ultimately, successful communication is communication that successfully transfers the intended meaning from one individual to at least one other. Right? So if I'm trying to tell you something and you don't understand what I want you to understand from it, in one sense, perhaps you're to blame for not understanding me correctly, but if given the success conditions for communication is that you really now have the meaning I'm trying to convey to you, it's also my failing if you don't understand it correctly. So trying to find some kind of common ground to communicate with each other is something very important to do. And this is one reason to really try to spend time mastering language, at least to the extent that you can make yourself as clear as possible. So, and just on that note, for assignments in this course, written critical responses, that final essay, I will be evaluating spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, things like that, because a great piece of writing is going to not have grammatical errors or spelling errors and so on. But don't worry too much about those. That there's not tons of emphasis on that. You can have some typos and some things like that, and it's not like you're automatically going to do terrible on the assignments or something. What really matters is if I can understand the ideas. So it's when the language gets in the way of clearly expressing yourself, that's when the largest issues come up. And that's really what I want to focus on. Now, in trying to be very clear, trying to make an excellent argument or have an excellent argument, try to avoid rhetorical questions whenever possible, particularly in your own writing. They do serve a good function. They are a useful kind of linguistic tool. You're certainly going to see rhetorical questions in some of what we read, and posing the odd one in your own piece can be okay. But if you're really trying to make an important point, don't pose it as a rhetorical question. I'll come back to that when we're talking about the use of language. Also, don't have any hidden or unstated parts in your arguments, except parts that are very obvious. Now, if you read through the brief introduction to philosophical argumentation, I talk, or write, I guess, more at length about this. But a hidden or an unstated part of an argument generally is something that somebody doesn't think is worth saying, but is required to really make the reasoning work. So, we can come up with all sorts of examples about this, but really, when we are communicating with each other, we typically, in a sense, cut corners. We try to save time and energy by not actually coming out and saying absolutely every single thing that needs to be said or understood to be able to understand an argument or a particular set of reasons. So you know, look, if I'm doing some kind of work around my house, I'm doing some kind of renovation or something, and say there's an electrical wire nearby that I need to sort of move or navigate around or something. Let's say somebody points out to me, they say, Carl, you know the electricity's still on, right? As I'm holding a metal tool or something, but to like touch an outlet or something like this, right? They say, the electricity's still on. Just that, right? I go, oh, right, better go turn that off. Now, of course, what are they really saying? If they're just saying the electricity's on, it's just a fact, right? But that doesn't point to anything else. I might say, sure, yeah, it's on. So what, right? What does that lead to? What does that support? What's the conclusion? Well, just by saying the electricity's on, given the context there I am holding a metal object near an outlet or something, really, what's the full idea or the full argument being expressed? It would be something like this. The electricity's still on. If the electricity's still on and you touch the outlet with that metal object, then you're going to get electrocuted. You don't want to get electrocuted, so you ought to go turn the electricity off. Right? Like, really, that's what we're trying to say. And if we wanted to put it into a kind of formal logic, we could probably even make that more cumbersome to sort of fully express. But ultimately, what are we doing? That's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to say, hey, before you use that metal tool to do what you want to do, you should go turn the electricity off, because otherwise there's going to be bad results. That takes a lot more to say. That takes more time and more energy to say. The other person probably knows that's where that's all going, right? And in fact, it can be kind of insulting to over-explain what we mean in most contexts, right? In a lot of contexts. So we don't always say absolutely everything that needs to be said to make an idea or an argument fully clear. Try to be as clear as possible. Even if you feel like you might be, in some sense, insulting my intelligence, that's okay, right? Just regard me as sort of slow to understand. And when we're talking about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates the other day, at least in Plato's dialogues with Socrates, at least in some of them, Socrates himself, it's not clear if he's pretending. I think he's probably pretending. He pretends not to really understand things that most people understand quickly. And the reason he does that is to try to get people to really get clear about their assumptions, about everything that's going into their own reasoning and their own views. Because once it's all clearly stated, then we can really engage with it, right? We can draw out hidden assumptions, we can draw out things that often go unstated, and we just think everybody believes or are understood, but in fact might be more controversial than you realize. So really the first step of having a great argument is making it really, really clear and trying to clearly express all the parts of it, all the assumptions that go into it, all the beliefs, all the premises, all the reasons, except of course things that are really, really brutally obvious. Right? There are, you don't have to explain absolutely every tiny little piece. There is a line somewhere that, something just doesn't need more explanation. But it's a little bit further removed than you might normally think. So explain yourself really, really clearly. Try to articulate every part of the argument you have. Imagine that I'm not going to follow you very well, that I'm not too bright. I need a little bit of hand-holding. Tell me exactly what it is you're trying to say, and why I should believe it, and how the reasons work. And some of the feedback you're going to get on your written work from me are probably going to be, quite honestly, being clear is number one. If I'm going to criticize your piece, odds are I'm going to criticize it for not being clear enough about something. I need to hear more about that point. I need to hear why I should believe it. I need to hear what that shows me. What's the premise? What's the conclusion? How does this work? So clarity above all. I was already talking about this with the hidden or unstated parts. If you make assumptions in an argument, which is fine, you can make assumptions in an argument, you clearly stipulate them, or you admit, you identify them. You say, here is what this argument is assuming is true. Because arguments can't show absolutely everything. We are limited, finite creatures. We can't prove every single point we make. But part of what we can do when we're reasoning, we're making arguments, is really make some assumptions about our starting points, right? Here's where I'm going to start. I can't support these points anymore. I think they're true or probably true. Maybe somebody will object to them. But this is where I'm going to start. And I'm going to try to show you what follows from the starting point, right? So when I was talking about sort of building up the complexity of an argument, starting at sort of the simplest, most obvious things and ending at your ultimate conclusion, you don't always have space for that, right? Especially if I only give you a few pages. You might have to start sort of part way up that scale, right? You say, look, I know I could start at sort of the most obvious thing and I'd have to work my way up to here, but I want to just start here to show you that if that's true, the conclusion that's over here is going to follow from, 2 or 3 steps. I might need another 3 or 4 or 5 different steps to get to the starting point and really give a rock solid case, an argument that somebody would have real trouble dealing with. But you just don't always have that. So you can make assumptions as long as you're clear about what they are, right? And they're assumptions that at least certainly could be true, right? If you make assumptions that are just so wildly controversial, almost nobody is going to believe them. Those aren't good assumptions to have, but you can have assumptions that might be controversial, right? It's not something most people are going to agree on, but at least a chunk of people will. Secondly, so excellent arguments, right? Number 1, clarity. They're clear. That's above all clear. Second point, the premises in an excellent argument are less controversial than the conclusion. This, in some sense, should be pretty obvious just given the structure of an argument, because in an argument, the conclusion is gaining support from the premise or premises. And so if your premise or premises are more controversial than the conclusion, the argument just is not going to work the way it's supposed to. When we're talking about what it is for something to be controversial, it's really this question of how likely are other people to believe them. Arguments really are trying to give us good reason to believe something that's controversial, right? Something that people don't generally believe already, which is why we're arguing in the first place. Again, we're finite beings. We reason a lot. We reason practically every day, but we often do a lot of it sort of on autopilot, and we don't have to make our reasoning clear. We don't have to articulate ourselves and argue with each other about everything, because often a lot of it's really straightforward. We just, look, I don't have to make arguments with people that if a heavy object's unsupported, it's going to fall towards the earth. It just, we all know that. There might be a few people who really think it's not going to happen one of these times, and I am of the mind that one of these times it might not. Maybe. But when I'm actually just living my day-to-day life, I just expect that's going to happen. So I don't need to argue with other people and try to give them reason to believe that when they already believe it. So we have to have premises that are less controversial, that is more acceptable, more likely to be true in many people's estimation than the conclusion is. The conclusion is also worth arguing for. If the conclusion is in some sense really safe, it's not really controversial at all, then it's just not worth actually having an argument. So look, if I pick up our course text here, and I flip to just a random page 80. I just flipped to page 80. This is the Bayer piece, and here he says, let me just, here's a sentence. Leibniz has made this point very persuasively, right? If my conclusion is that on page 80 of this text, Kurt Bayer writes, Leibniz has made this point very persuasively, it's not worth arguing for, right? Just pick the book up. There it is. Go take a look at page 80. Really, no more needs to be said, right? That's not really worth having an argument about. Just like it's not really worth arguing about whether or not heavy objects will fall towards the earth when they're not supported, and all sorts of other things, right? It's painful when you get too hungry, and pain's, generally speaking, a bad thing, right? Some things are just not controversial enough to really be worth having an argument about. So when you're thinking about your own arguments and how to construct them, how to make sure they're really good ones, keep in mind what it is you're really trying to argue for. Make sure it's a point that's controversial enough that it's really worth having that argument. Make sure that your premise or premises are less controversial than that conclusion. Otherwise, they're not going to provide that conclusion support. Fourth, excellent arguments make a clear connection between the particular and the general. As I said in the What is Philosophy piece, as well as that video lecture, philosophy is typically interested in general or abstract truths. And so whenever we're dealing with some particular sort of matter or case or something like that, the particular and the general are going to relate to each other. And you can think about this fairly easily as the general level are general truths or principles, and the particular level are individual cases or examples. And using examples can be a great thing to do in philosophy. And we can move between those levels. So we take some kind of example, right? Say we give an example of something that seems obviously bad to do, right? Lie to someone in order to hurt their feelings, right? That seems bad. So we could give an example, right? And I could cook up an example, make up some fictional people, right? Say, okay, imagine we've got, I don't know, Jim and, I don't know, Jerry, and Jim lies to Jerry just to hurt his feelings and so on. And then, general principle out of that, well, it's bad to lie to people and hurt their feelings and so on. But of course, if it's something more controversial, somebody lies to avoid hurting somebody's feelings. They tell a white lie. Is that really wrong? Ooh, that's a trickier one. So if we're trying to think on the general level, is it wrong to lie to somebody to avoid hurting their feelings? Well, we might want to look at particular examples to see what our intuitions are like there, right? So particular examples can be provided as a way to point out a kind of objection to a general point. We can also provide an example as a way of trying to extract a general point from it, right? We say, look, if we look at this situation and we think this about it, that this was right or wrong or whatever it might be, here's the general point that seems to be being made. Ultimately, we want to get to the general point, but seeing how it relates to the particular often helps us do that, helps us see if we're right, helps us connect that argument to reality or our lived experience. Right? Ultimately, we're interested in those general points, not just the particular cases, because it's really on that general level that we get a greater understanding of the world around us. Just like, look, if somebody's a physicist or something, and they're trying to figure out how bodies move through space, ultimately, what are we trying to do? Come up with some kind of like mathematical expression of that we can apply to many particular instances, not just one or not just a couple, but figure out some general form that applies and explains, and hopefully you can even predict all sorts of particular cases in the future. Fifth, excellent arguments proactively raise and respond to good objections. So an excellent argument will be one that is, in some sense, aware of its blind spots or aware of how it can be controversial. An excellent argument will try to take steps to show why it's not really affected by or impacted by good objections. The sorts of reasons that people could put forward to show why somehow that argument doesn't really work the way it's supposed to, the conclusion's not really true, or the premises aren't probably true, or the conclusion doesn't really follow from the premises. An excellent argument will be sort of self-conscious of that. It will be aware of that and try to show why good objections aren't really as good as they might seem. And this is part of why I'm having you engage in those forum activities, precisely so you can start exchanging reasons and start seeing how other people can interpret certain reasons and certain arguments, so that you can proactively raise and respond to those sorts of issues in your critical responses in your essays. Right? And that will be another area where I might criticize your arguments. If there's a fairly, what I might consider obvious, and it's not always obvious to everybody, which is part of the reason I want you engaging in that forum environment. If you're making an argument that seems to have a fairly obvious objection to it, and that objection is dealt with, that itself constitutes a kind of weakness in the argument. Right? And often we express this when we're talking to each other with a phrase or a phrase similar to something like, what about? Right? Well, what about this? You're saying we should do this or believe this, but what about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? The what about is precisely indicating that there's an objection of some sort. Now, good arguments should be aware of and try to respond to objections like that. That said, an excellent argument isn't just a series of what-abouts. Because if it's just a series of what-abouts, all we're really doing is raising a bunch of objections. Ultimately, we want good answers. We want to figure out what the best answer to something is, which means we need to have some kind of positive position. An objection, when it's being posed to an argument, is really negative in the sense that it itself isn't really telling us what's correct or true. It's trying to point out some kind of issue in another attempt to tell us what's correct or true. Okay, so that takes us through sort of the highlight reel of a brief introduction to philosophical argumentation. As I said, there's quite a bit more in the piece itself, so I still encourage you to go read it. I'm going to take, again, a brief look at the use of language. That piece is a little more succinct. It's shorter. Think about that almost as sort of practical advice about some do's and don'ts in your own writing. So talk just for a few moments about the important points there. So as I said, there is some repetition between the two pieces. Consider that emphasis as a kind of reminder or extra highlighting of things to really keep in mind. First, be as precise as possible. Try to be as clear as possible. Try to take some time to explain what you don't mean. If you explain yourself in a certain sort of way and you say, okay, here's the argument, and you can see somebody misinterpreting that in a certain kind of way, spend the time to write in your piece, here's what this means. Explain, explain, explain. Here's what this doesn't mean, right? And show why a common misunderstanding is not what you're doing. Again, avoid rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are, they look like questions, they might sound like questions, but they're really a kind of covert attempt to say something. So when we use rhetorical questions, generally we're trying to actually just make a statement. We're trying to say this is true or that's true or whatever it is. But we don't come out and say it. Instead, we pose it as a question. But of course, because it's a question, although the answer might seem clear to you, it's not always to your audience. And when a question is asked, it's really up to somebody else to answer it. And they might not answer it the way you want them to. Sometimes we pose rhetorical questions or something like that just to put a little distance between us and what it is we're trying to say or suggest. And we do that as a kind of buffer. It's a kind of safety net. Right? If I pose something as a rhetorical question rather than just come out and say it, then if I'm giving good reason to think that I'm wrong, I can always say, well, it's just a question. So, with right now around the world and just thinking Canada and the United States, there are questions right now, questions concerning COVID about, when and how should we reopen? And right now there is some opening going on. And of course, look, we might think it's a good idea, we might think it's a bad idea, not really engaging in that argument here. Let's just say I think reopenings right now is a bad idea. And if I'm having a conversation with someone and I want to make that point, instead of just coming out and saying, I think it's a mistake to be reopening the way we are, I could instead say, well, is it really a good idea to be reopening the way we are? Right? Now, that's a rhetorical question if I'm really trying to make a statement without making the statement. I might just pose it as a genuine question, right? If I really I'm not sure, I want more information, right? It can be a legitimate question. But if I'm trying to actually express something, if I'm trying to actually say, I don't think that's right, posing it as a rhetorical question gives me this kind of safety. Because if somebody says, well, sure, of course we should be, and here's all the reasons why we should be doing that, I can say, oh, well, yeah, it was just a question. It's just a question, right? Don't do that. If it's a real question, pose it as a real question, and then do your best to answer it. If you're trying to say something, come out and say it, even if you're wrong. It's far better to come out and say it and be wrong than to pose it as a rhetorical question, because then at least you're clear. And it's only when we're clear that we can fruitfully engage with each other in the first place. Second, use qualifiers. Qualifiers concern how likely a claim is to be true. Really, it's the question of probability or possibility. So when we're thinking about necessity and impossibility, if something's necessary, it has to be true. If something's impossible, it can't be true. Generally speaking, we're interested in that domain of possibility, things that could be true but aren't necessarily true, right? They might be true, they might be false. And then typically we're often interested in claims of probability because we don't know exactly and for sure if something's true or false. That's the whole reason we want to argue about it in the first place. So use qualifiers, right? Likely to be true, unlikely to be true, this is probable, that's improbable, this is more likely than that because. Right? Also use quantifiers. Those help establish the scope of a claim, right? Are you talking about all people, some people, no people, a few people, right? If we've got a particular example we're dealing with, that might show us, right? And you can use your own experience. That shows us that at least one person has had a certain kind of experience. That's evidence for something, but it's a lot weaker evidence than, say, if it's been an experience shared by many, many people, or even most people. So think about to how many of a general category or class or set or group of things the claim applies. And try to be as precise as possible by using those quantifiers and qualifiers. Okay, 4, define your terms. This is something else that comes up in the other piece, the Introduction to Philosophical Argumentation. Make it again here. Whenever you're using a term that deviates from common use, or it's a technical term of some sort, right? It's not a term you could expect most people to be familiar with. It's just, you know, we grabbed a random assortment of undergraduate students, not in any particular field. Think about that really as your target audience. And if it's a term that they wouldn't know, if it's a term, say, you've learned in this course or some other course, or, you know, in learning about some particular subject matter, that you've picked up certain kind of vocabulary. When you first use that term, take a moment to define it. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. Take a look at both of these pieces again for a little bit more information on that. But take a moment to explain what you mean by the term. There's good odds I'm going to know what you mean, right? But when you define the term, you show me what you mean by it. Because even people, take, say, philosophers, can, reasonable people can be using the same term in different sorts of ways. They understand it differently. They mean something different by it. They're trying to accomplish something in their active communication by using that term. And if we both use the term, but we mean something slightly different, we might wind up talking right past each other. And then our whole activity of trying to reason together just falls apart because we didn't have the common starting position we thought we did. Don't be too passionate. Now, it's fine to be passionate, right? And in fact, I hope you're passionate about a whole lot of things. But being passionate about something isn't an argument on its own, right? The level of passion someone has for some sort of position, some kind of conclusion, doesn't by itself give us reason to believe it. It gives us reason to believe that that person is very committed to it. But unless we already know that that person is correct through the use of good reasons or something, their passion alone and their commitment to something doesn't give us good reason to believe that it's actually true. And in fact, we've got good reason to believe that passion by itself doesn't really give us reason to believe anything, because people can be passionate about contrary things, right? People can be very passionate on two sides of a debate where both sides can't both be right. So passion on its own isn't an argument, and ultimately what we want are good arguments. We want good reasons, right? Also, just generally speaking in the academic world, tempering passion a little bit is advisable in your academic writing. Why? In part because academics and sort of just experts in general are trying to get something of an objective view of the world. They're not trying to view the world just sort of from their own point of view. Rather, they're trying to, in some sense, step outside of what are our own limitations and come to a broader, more general understanding of the way things are that goes beyond our own inclinations, proclivities, biases, and so on. So really, that's what we're trying to get to, some general view of the world that really is correct. And passion can be a roadblock to that. Not necessarily, and this isn't to say be stone cold and passion and emotion have absolutely no place here. It's not that at all. Just when you're writing and trying to construct an excellent argument and in your use of language, keep in mind that passion by itself isn't a reason to believe something. 6th, use punctuation correctly. Here's a quick little list of punctuation marks that you're likely to use in academic writing, particularly in philosophy. Just starting at the left and moving over, we've got a period. Use that to end sentences. We've got a comma. Use that to either break up the clauses in a sentence, so those sort of natural little chunks of the sentence where you could sort of cut pieces out and still have a sentence left. If you use a pair of commas, you can offset something that could be omitted from the sentence. So you can use a pair of commas the same way you'd use a set of parentheses or brackets to put in some information that doesn't necessarily have to be there. So for instance, on point 5, don't be too passionate when trying to argue. If this were a fuller sentence, the when trying to argue could be offset by a pair of commas on either side rather than parentheses. Question mark. Use that when you pose a question, right? So if you pose a question, make sure you punctuate it with a question mark, not a period. If it's not a question, don't use the question mark. I know it's pretty obvious, but it's still worth saying. Next to that, there's a pair of quotation marks there. Use those whenever you're reproducing somebody else's exact words. You can also use them to represent dialogue between people, within a text, even if it's not sort of exact words, trying to make that clear what you're doing by the context of the writing. The ... the ellipses within it, you can use that within a set of quotation marks to indicate that something's been omitted. It can also be indicated to sort of mark a trail off. Generally speaking, don't do that, at least not in your writing for me, because I'm always going to sort of wonder, well, what's in the trail off? What are you trying to get at? Exclamation point, right? Used for emphasis, excitement, right? Use punctuation correctly. Do it, please. Now, there probably shouldn't be too many of those in your academic writing, and this relates back to the don't be too passionate part. You can use an exclamation point to try to really emphasize something, right? It sort of indicates a certain kind of exclamation emphasis. Don't overuse them, right? If every other sentence is ending in an exclamation point, they just start to lose their effectiveness. So a well-placed exclamation point can be welcome. It's perfectly fine not to use any, but certainly don't use too many. Don't use a lot of them. They should be used very sparingly. Lastly, the semicolon. This is probably the single trickiest piece of punctuation to use, certainly in this list here. I think it's the trickiest, most likely to be misused. If you don't know how to use it correctly, just don't use it. Anytime a semicolon could be used, a different piece of punctuation could be used instead. There's really two main uses for a semicolon. One, instead of putting a period between two sentences, you can put a semicolon to show that the content of those two sentences is really closely related. That they could be really just sort of put into one sentence, which effectively that's what you're doing with the semicolon. But a semicolon can be replaced by a period, not by a comma. It's not a replacement for a comma. So don't use it that way. Anytime there's a semicolon, you should be able to replace it with a period, and then you'd have two full sentences that read correctly. So keep that in mind. It can replace a period, not a comma, when used in a normal sentence. You can also use semicolons to differentiate items on a list. So if you've got, you indicate there's going to be a list, you've got a colon, the two dots, and then you've got a series of things that come after, and there are commas being used within the items on the list because it's, sort of a lengthy list with a lot going on. You can use the semicolons to mark off the different parts on the list. So you can use it that way as well. These are really the two main uses. Like I said, you never have to use it. You could just use periods, right? You never have to use them to separate parts of a sentence like that. You can just make two new sentences. You can also use commas or numbers or letters or something like that in the list. So you don't have to use semicolons. And just sort of trying to sprinkle them in, sort of like a dash of spice or something into your writing, on its own isn't going to impress me. I would far rather see punctuation used correctly than an attempt to make the writing seem really fancy by including semicolons if they're not being used correctly. Now, if you do have questions about, where you can put in a semicolon, maybe you're doing a piece of writing and you're thinking of sticking one somewhere and you're not sure about it, feel free to email me or contact me to somehow and just say, look, can I put a semicolon here? Why or why not? Once you sort of get how semicolons work, they're fairly easy to use, but there aren't frequent places where they should be used, typically. So like an exclamation point, if they are going to be used, probably don't overuse them. They lose their effectiveness then. But if you are going to use them, if you want to use them, do try to use them correctly. And if you're just not certain, just don't do it. It's perfectly fine to never use a semicolon in your writing for me. And frankly, I think in your writing in general. So that takes us to the end of what I wanted to share today. Hopefully this has been informative. It gives you a bit better of an idea of just what's going on in those two pieces, as well as some highlights about what I think are the really important takeaways from them. Again, do go through those pieces. There's more information in there. So I certainly think it's still worth reading them, even if you watch the video. So I hope that helps give you a bit of a better idea of what we're going to be doing in terms of the course and philosophy in general, evaluating, analyzing, creating arguments, sharing them with each other, trying to reason, share reasons and objections with each other. gives you some indication of what really great arguments are like, what I'm going to be looking for, some of the qualities that I'm going to be looking for in your own work, some tips just on how to express yourself in that clear manner. That ultimately that's what I'm looking for. More than anything, I want you to express yourself clearly. I also want you to reason well and really to engage with the material, engage with each other, and engage with the reasons, and I'm going to engage with your reasons. But I find most frequently the criticism I have of work that I see is just that it's not clear enough yet, that more needs to be said to really make it clear. Often, once something is articulated clearly enough, even if I don't agree with it, and that's not how I'm grading you, it's not, do I agree with you? No, it's really a question of, does this meet those standards of something of very high quality? Is it clear? Is it reasonable? Is it the kind of argument that a rational person who saw it, whether they agreed with the conclusion or not, would have to say, that does provide good reason to believe that conclusion. I have to think seriously about that if I want to believe something else. I have to figure out what's wrong there. So ultimately, that's what we're going for. I hope you have a better idea of sort of the goal and how to reach that goal from these two pieces from the video today. Tomorrow, Thursday, I'll be posting a video on Tolstoy and Quinn. So we'll be getting into the first sort of real course content tomorrow. And that is going to give you a better sense just of exactly what this all looks like in practice. We're going to see our first set of arguments on trying to figure out what the meaning of life really is. So I hope you're doing well. I hope you've had a good day. I'll see you, well, you'll see me again tomorrow in my next video. Until then, bye for now.